right, family. Sorry about the delay. Trying to make sure we connect to everything, and Facebook and excuse me, Instagram has been a little bit interesting. It is not allowing me to connect to both. So we got to make difficult choices, and when I make those choices, I much rather be on Facebook than Instagram. But I had to make sure it was connected to Facebook. I don't know what that's all about. So, doo doo doo. So happy to have you back with me for another episode. I appreciate your energy, your time. You can be any place in the world, but you are here today with us. The Soul Family. I got to get my notes, get those together. Tonight, I look forward to continuing our discussion on ego. We will be discussing ego defenses and a couple of questions that allow us to be able to assess where we are functioning within our ego, right? Where we'll be able to recognize if we slide in between different types of different types of egos, or if we're stable in one. Just a couple of questions for us to be able to assess how we are functioning within the various egos of healthy ego, weak ego, wounded ego, inflated ego, right? So, but if this is your first time here, what we do here is discuss healing in all its various forms in an effort for us to become the best version of ourselves. We create this in a collective environment of a group of people, the soul family, who are all in the same boat and on the same journey as you. So we can all tap into that collective energy of healing, growth, and evolution. We do this every Tuesday night at 7 p.m. Eastern. And then we also have a Thursday night show at 7 p.m. Eastern. That is a spinoff of our Tuesday night show in an effort to allow us to reconnect to our childlike self by allowing someone to read to us. We have book club, right? So make sure you follow, subscribe, like, share, so you get those notifications when we go live. The beginning of every show, we do a little bit of energy work. And this week we are on our throat. We are on our throat. The throat is the energy point or the chakra for your authenticity, being the true version of yourself, your communication, healthy communication, clear communication, and your expression, how you express who you are, your identity, and the truth. Yours, mine, and the truth at whole. If you are into color therapy, you want to think of light blue. Light blue is the color for your throat. So you want to eat more light blue foods. You want to spend some time in light blue lights. You want to wear some light blue clothes. I didn't even recognize that I was wearing a light blue shirt. I just thought about it now. So my spirit must have knew today was going to be a good communication day and had me put on this light blue shirt, which is kind of new, but I like it. If you are into essential oils and aromatherapy, you want to think of chamomile, peppermint, cypress, bergamot. All of those are very good scents to activate the energy of your throat, your communication, your authenticity, your expression, and your truth, right? If you are into crystals and gemstones, you want to think turquoise, aquamarine, lapis lazuli, and blue lace agate. I hold that up because that's what's on this ring, blue lace agate. All those are very good for communication. So if you're wondering why I'm always wearing this ring, I got to do a lot of communicating, whether it be with you all on the show or in my daily work. I do a lot of communicating as consulting, right? So the next thing we're going to do is a little bit of sound therapy. I'm going to hit the bowl for a little bit, and then I got a new toy for us that I'm so excited about. I'm probably going to get a couple more of these. This one is cool. This is my first one, so I won't complain too much. But we have a round Okay, I thought it was upside down. It is upside down. Okay. Yes. A round rain stick, right? So I'm so excited about it. I love rain sticks. I always loved them from when I was in the classroom to now that we're doing a little bit of healing and sound therapy. It's fantastic. I love rain sticks, right? So during this time, all you really have to do is just focus on a relaxing energy, calming yourself, releasing the stresses of the day, and getting into a space that allows you to participate and actively engage, or at least receive the information to help you on your own journey. So now just relax. All right, so the next thing we do will be a little bit of breath work. Today we are going to do a different breath exercise than what we normally do. I have a new one for us. Today we are going to do 5-0-5. And it is like every other breathing exercise. The numbers indicate breathe in, hold, and release. So for 5-0-5, we will breathe in for 5 seconds, hold for 0 seconds, and release for 5 seconds. During this time, I want you to breathe with me and focus in on your energy about your authenticity, who you are authentically, your communication, your expressions, and your truth. On the count of 3, we will start with 5-0-5. 1, 2, 3. Breathe in 5, 2, 3, 4, 5. Exhale 5, 2, 3, 4, 5. Breathe in 5, 2, 3, 4, 5. Exhale 5, 2, 3, 4, 5. Breathe in 5, 2, 3, 4, 5. Exhale 5, 2, 3, 4, 5. Last time, family. Breathe in 5, 2, 3, 4, 5. Exhale 5, 2, 3, 4, 5. Lastly, we will do some affirmations. These are affirmations that you can say to help charge the energy of your throat or rebalance you when you are out of alignment with your authenticity, communication, expression, and truth. During this time, all you have to do is just repeat after me and incorporate these affirmations into your daily life. They will benefit you as you are trying to adjust and change the energy that you encounter every day. I speak and hear the truth. I communicate honestly. I live an authentic life. I am fearless and free. I trust what I have to say. I speak and hear truth. I communicate honestly. I live an authentic life. I am fearless and free. And I trust what I have to say. And when you say those, make sure you believe them, because the power is in the belief, not just in the saying. And with that, family, we will get started with the show. Let's get this party started. Move my mic a little bit. Okay, so this is your weekly reminder that you can purchase 7 spaces of healing for yourself. It is a good starting point when you know there are some changes that need to be made and you don't quite know where to go. 7 spaces of healing will help you conceptualize 7 spaces that you need to create within yourself, energy you need to have, and 7, those same 7 spaces you want to make sure that you place yourself in, that you're a part of these energies. A space of love, a space of healing, a space of solitude, a space of risk without judgment, a space of accountability, and a space for forgiveness. You can purchase this yourself. Available now on Amazon. Half man, half Amazon. So if you're new here, you don't get that joke. I talked about it before. I got a homeboy. Well, when we were graduating from high school, you run around and everybody signs your yearbook and things of that nature. And he was signing everybody's yearbook with this one saying. Nas had this rap. He said he half man, half amazing, right? Amazing. And my homeboy kept writing half man, half Amazon. And when our other friend seen that, he was like, half man, half Amazon. My homeboy looked at that like, what? So occasionally I still will say half man, half Amazon. It brings a little joy to me. It helps me laugh. Right. So again, today we're going to get into the conversations of continuing our conversations on ego. We've been learning a lot about ego. And I think to better understand ourselves, we have to better understand how the ego works so we can move from this space of death of the ego, and healing the ego is another space that we need to move into, because we can't function without the ego. We have to function with it. So we don't want to have the death of the ego. We want to heal the ego so we can function in a better ego. But once we learn to understand how the ego functions within our lives, then we can better understand what type of medicine the ego needs to heal it, right? The physician inside of us will help to heal that ego. Toddy, thanks for being here. And I don't think today I'm going to call you out on not being here on the end. As a matter of fact, I might do it anyway so I can catch you slipping, since you caught me slipping the other day. Right. So family, we're on YouTube, Facebook, Twitch. Yeah, we're only on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitch today because Instagram is giving me a headache. So sometime I'm talking to people that you don't necessarily see, but I see them. So one thing I kind of want to talk about is the performative male. I had an interesting conversation over the weekend that really put this idea in my face. I've heard about the performative male, but I really didn't quite understand it. And not to say that I have a ton of understanding it now, but the concept wound up being in my face where I had to really think about it, because in a conversation with a friend, the realization came up because they had this idea where masculinity is limited, very, very, very limited. So when I say performative male, I mean a man or a male identifying person who performs a very specific action that is attributed to the male gender, right? So one of those things is paying for all the bills, right? When we talk about provider males, we talk about provisions as paying bills. Even though we learn to understand that provisions go way beyond paying bills, when we're talking about the performative male, we're talking about them performing one specific action and losing sight of all the other things that incorporate being a man, right? So when you're dealing with a performative male and they align with one thing, so like we use the idea of paying bills, they struggle in other areas very deeply because they are just performing what they think a man to be. So example, you can find you a man that pays all the bills, but he's a terrible communicator, right? Communication is an important part. We're working on the throat today. The throat is the energy point. And communication is an important part of our existence, not just for men, but also for women. So when we're thinking about males and masculinity, healthy communication is also something a healthy male should have, right? Beyond the performative male. What wound up leading to this is, as I was saying, I was having a conversation with a friend, and they were stuck on, well, a man should want to pay, or a man should want to do these things specifically that relate to money, right? And I remember when they just kept saying money. They just kept talking about money, talking about money. And I asked them, what else does a man do? What else? What other role is a man? And they were stuck, right? They were fully stuck. And I'm saying this to you, so when you're looking at men, we go beyond the ability to finance, right? Because there are other things that are necessary to make a healthy relationship, a healthy family, a healthy foundation, dreams, goals, all those things. There are other ingredients to do those things. So when I'm saying this, so when we're looking at masculinity, we don't also confine masculinity in a box, right? And this ties into another experience that I had in this conversation. I really, as we've done some work on ourselves, our expectations and our standards change a little bit, right? Now, sometimes we can go to the total other extreme, but at some point we got to bring it back to the middle, right? And I was stating in this conversation that I really had two non-negotiable expectations that I could stand on, right? That I'm not flexing on, period. One was or is I want to be seen as a human being, not just for my ability to pay, right? And it was wild because I stated this in this conversation, which was funny. And I used the example, like I said, I'm to date me is not free. I have an expectation of treatment. I'm going to do some things for you. I expect some things in return. It's not free. It's things I like. And I used the example of a birthday gift, right? I was like, so on my birthday, I'm expect a present or something like that. And my friend was like, as a man, why would you even care about your birthday? And all I could think about was, are you hearing what you're saying? Move beyond man. As an individual, I should not want to celebrate my birthday, right? That's what I mean about the performative male, because it binds men to a box that doesn't allow them to experience the full spectrum of emotions and joy and celebrating yourself and things like that. It puts them in a box where all they have to do is just work, pay bills, and die, right? So tying into the other expectation that I had is I have expectations on how I'm going to be treated. As I said, I like reciprocity. I like to be able to be in a situation where I'm giving and receiving, right? And that's one of the more newer standards for me because there was a space and time where I really didn't have these same expectations on how I am going to be treated. I held expectations for myself on how I'm going to treat others, but the reciprocity in that idea was not there because I was not also having a standard or expectation on how I am to be treated, right? And the wild things in that conversation, the friend told me that as a man, how could you have expectations for how you want to be treated? Why would you even want a birthday gift? And I kept saying, like, are you expecting a man not to have expectations or standards for treating? And she was like, yeah. She wants someone that will kiss her bottom, which is very, very interesting, right? And I say all this to tie us into this idea, right? As it was my first time experiencing a space where having expectations and standards was not welcome, right? And then it really made me think about why was I welcomed before? And I recognized that people were welcoming me because I didn't have these standards and expectations for myself, right? And I'm saying this to you because as you change and evolve and you have expectations or your expectations for treatment have grown and evolved as well, you may find you in a space you'll feel so good about those new expectations, right? But you may still find yourself in a space where the new you is no longer welcome. And you will be okay with that. One of the reasons you change and reshape these expectations is so that you can filter out the riffraff. What's that? Reticular activating system. We talked about that 15 times during the universal laws. And that simply means is your brain starts filtering out what is not in alignment with your goal, right? So you will find yourself in a space where your new expectations will not be welcome. That does not mean that you do not have expectations. That is an opportunity for you to be okay with having expectations and they not get you to a specific destination, right? You got other opportunities. Having expectations will not erase experiences, right? And experiences, we have some yeses, we have some nos. So be okay with the nos when your expectations are not welcome. So last week, we move into the review. Last week, we talked about, what did we talk about? I know we did the weak ego. And what else? We did the weak ego. And I think we finished up wounded ego. What is that? Yes, we did do the wounded / fragile ego. So in the wounded and fragile ego, just a high level review of that is a person's sense of self-worth or dignity or identity that overwhelms the normal coping mechanisms, right? That's important because when we have a wounded ego or a fragile ego, you know what ego shows up to protect that? The inflated ego. So if we have wounds within ourselves that we are carrying, that we are maybe not acknowledging, or we are acknowledging and not taking steps to heal those wounds, we can almost assure ourselves that we are functioning in an inflated ego because the inflated ego shows up to protect the wounded ego, right? Wounded ego showed up in two very specific ways. The externalizing wounded ego and that pushing the pain outwards, taking their wounds out on everybody, or the internalizing wounded ego, and that is turning that pain and injury on yourself. Things like self-harm, things like taking drugs, things of those natures are all signs of a wounded ego being negotiated through life with an inflated ego. The next thing we talked about was weak ego, which is different than a wounded ego, right? A weak ego is a limited capacity to regulate impulses, good or bad. Your excitement can create impulsive actions as well. So when we're talking about a weak ego, it's about impulsivity, right? Your limited capacity to regulate impulses, tolerate frustration, and manage anxiety, as well as adapt to reality. But let me make sure we talk about this limited again. That means that there is a lack of capacity, right? You may have a little bit, but you don't have enough to navigate the emotions of the world, to tolerate frustration, manage reality and anxiety, manage anxiety and adapt to reality, right? It showed up through chronic childhood stress, inconsistent and neglect of abusive caregiving, lack of emotional containment. That's very important because emotional containment is a space for you to be able to experience emotions, a safe space to feel feelings, right? Scratch. Feel emotions. And I made that distinguishing thing. I changed it to emotions because emotions are natural. Each word that we deal with creates an emotion. Feelings are the stories we tell ourselves about the emotion. So a weak ego is one that has limited capacity to deal with tolerance, tolerate frustration, manage anxiety, and adapt to reality, right? Did I skip something? All right, so now we'll start discussing ego defense mechanisms, right? This is important because the ego is there to protect us. We recognize that sometimes we confuse the familiar with safe, so good things for us also seems dangerous. And since our is to protect, it shows up in those situations, right? Even good things that aren't familiar feel dangerous, right? So what ways do the ego defend itself, right? So ego defense mechanisms is not really about what you defend against, but how you defend against it, right? How do you defend against that? The example that we give, example that I can give about that is this idea around Napoleon complex, right? That label gets tossed out there a lot, right? But a lot of times, in defense of yourself, you are defending yourself against a lot of things that most people will also defend themselves. But again, it's not about what you defend yourself, but how you defend yourself. The first one we'll discuss is denial based ego. I love that joke. I'm childish. Every time I say denial, I always think it's more than a river in Egypt. I got my dad jokes down pat. Denial. As a matter of fact, I'm thinking about one I seen over the weekend. Well, I seen the last couple of weeks. How many tickles does it take to make an octopus laugh? If you know that, put it in the chat. So denial based ego. How does denial based ego function? It refuses to acknowledge reality that is too painful or too threatening. So it blocks awareness of facts, feelings, or experiences. We see that a lot of time with cognitive dissonance. When people who function in that space, a denial based ego, you can present facts to them. And you know what overrule facts? Their feelings and opinions. No matter how many facts that you can give to them, that is a perfect example of a denial based ego. If you give somebody a fact and they were like, well, all that's cool, but I still feel, they are functioning in a denial based ego. They feel threatened. Whether they recognize it or not, you challenging their opinions, their viewpoints, their thoughts is received as a threat, is internalized as a threat. So the only way to protect themselves is to deny those facts and the truth, right? Denial based ego normally shapes itself within early stages of development or acute distress. So we learn that denial from childhood. So some of us are still functioning in those childhood wounds, or if we're in the space of acute distress. Acute distress could be something as simple as facing eviction, facing a disease, layered loss of a loved one, stressed about bills. Layered stress can wind up creating that acute distress, right? When we think about denial, ego. I know I used the example of cognitive dissonance, but for parents and teachers or anyone who's ever had an argument with a 2-year old, you understand how denial based ego functions. Because a 2-year old will look you dead in your eyes and be like, that's not true. We give them a little break because their object permanence is just really getting shaped. You used to be able to trick them by just hiding it behind their back. So the first things that they do is learn denial, right? Denial-based ego starts with your childhood or deep in acute stress. The next ego defense mechanism is repression-based ego. What that means is it pushes unacceptable thoughts and impulses or memories into the unconscious, right? I remember there was a point in time that I used to think that I did not suffer from that, right? I had two things. Over the weekend, talking to a friend, they remembered something I don't even remember, right? Now, we wound up, after my father passed, I wound up talking to this friend, right? And they told me I cussed them out. And I have no recollection of that either. I think there's an area of me where, well, no, it's not that I know. I can recognize that some piece of me functions in repression ego. And I tied a lot of things around to the loss of my father, and I pushed that to the unconscious mind. Another example that I can give is, I talked about this on this show before. I was the person that found my grandmother when she passed away, right? And I always remembered that I was the person that found her when I passed away. When she passed away, but I didn't remember anything beyond that statement. And one time I was talking to my mama and she says to me, you know, you're the first one that found her. And I recognize that. And then she says, and when they found you. What? What are you talking about when they found me? I don't remember anything after. I didn't remember anything after I found my grandma after she passed, right? So my mom says, when they found you, you were in there pouring sugar in her mouth. I know my grandmother suffered from diabetes, and I know when her sugar get low, they give her, we used to have those little Neapolitan coconut bars. And that's one of the reasons I still love that red, white, and chocolate coconut bars. I don't even see them anymore. Well, I do see them, but you gotta be in very specific neighborhoods to see those coconut bars. But I've seen them. But when they found me, I was putting sugar in her mouth, right? And when my mother said that, I just broke down crying. Literally, immediately started crying. Because what she did was break that wall between the unconscious and the conscious mind. And the things that I had pushed to the back came to the front. And after she said it, I can remember it vividly. I can remember the smells. I can remember I walked to the kitchen 2-3 times before somebody found me trying to put sugar in my grandma's mouth. You know what I mean? So repression ego winds up pushing those unacceptable thoughts, impulses, or memories into the unconscious mind. It protects the ego. A repression ego protects the ego from the overwhelming effect. Sometimes it's easier for us to push it to our unconscious mind so that we don't become overwhelmed by our emotions or our experiences. It creates a safe space for us to function, right? Me talking about these ego defense mechanisms are not saying that these ego defense mechanisms are bad. It's for us to recognize them. They are neutral, and recognize how we move and function between these. We do function in denial-based ego. We also function in repression-based ego. It is a defense mechanism that protects us from the overwhelming effect, right? A repressed based ego can fracture awareness when it's overused. If you use repression too often, your awareness goes down. You detach and disconnect from the world around you in an effort to avoid that overwhelmed feeling. Your sense of self becomes split into different parts. There's a piece of you who experienced this, and there's a piece of you that does not even know it exists. Repression-based ego is a protective ego, as all ego is. And it is to protect you from the overwhelming effect. Next, we have projection-based ego, right? So what is projection-based ego? It attributes one own unacceptable thoughts to someone else. So that means when you think negative about yourself, instead of admitting that you are thinking those thoughts about yourself, you say they must, or you must think, right? I talked about a friend apologizing to me, and they said, I apologize for always letting you down. And I was so confused by that because I never said that. I don't even think that about you. That was an example of the projection-based ego. They were projecting the thoughts of themselves onto me. We have those, everyone has had that interaction where you're curious on why do you even think I think that? Because you don't think that. They do. So when you find yourself in that space where you are defending yourself against something you don't even think, take that pause and recognize if they are functioning in a projected ego, a projection-based ego. Projection-based ego externalizes conflict instead of integrating it. Instead of accepting conflict as a natural form of life, conflict happens. And integrating that understanding or integrating the lessons that conflict allow us to learn, they externalize the conflict and put it on other people, project it onto you, right? That's a perfect example of that is those times where people are accusing others of being hostile while being unconsciously aggressive oneself. If you've ever had that conversation and someone's like, why are you being aggressive? That could easily be a sign of projection-based ego. They're accusing you while not recognizing that they themselves are aggressive. Have you found yourself in a space where you were asking that question? And is there a possibility that we talk about it all the time? Game recognizes game. That extends beyond the game. So you may be able to easily recognize aggression in others because you are aggressive. You may have even laid the foundation for that aggression, but you're in that space of projection-based ego that you don't recognize that. right? So the perfect example again is accusing others of hostility while you yourself are being aggressive. The next one is the rationalizing ego. We talked about that a little bit when we did inflated ego, I believe. Rationalizing ego. A rationalizing ego explains away failure, guilt, or conflict with seemingly logical reasons, right? So I'm going through this. I went through this long enough ago, right? Where a friend acted rather ignorantly. And instead of admitting and taking accountability that maybe I was too aggressive, or maybe I wasn't being fair, maybe I was projecting, the guilt from treating a friend that way was too difficult for them to accept. So they applied it to, you must didn't like me. If you are quick to say that these behaviors, and they are just behaviors that are not the behaviors that you think should be happening, and you didn't leave much room for any other possibilities and perspectives, as we learn, perspectives are the tools that we use to navigate life. You too may be functioning in a rational ego. If you struggle to sit with that failure, that guilt, and transmute and move beyond that, you may be struggling with a rationalized ego. A rationalizing ego converts threat into reason. That's saying, I did this because you made me. That is a rationalizing ego. Not accepting your behaviors, pushing that on someone else. Not only is a double, it's projection, and then it's rationalizing. Had you not have done this, I wouldn't have done that. No, you still would have done that, because that's who you are. And you don't recognize that because you rationalize your shortcomings away and blame them on others, right? A rationalizing ego preserves self-esteem without the emotional processing. Again, that is the example where you don't have to think about if you were being aggressive or angry, or you feel guilty or shame, because you rationalized it away with, they did it, or that's how I'm supposed to react. If they hadn't have, you remove accountability and responsibility from yourself in an effort to protect your self-esteem without having to emotionally process it. Perfect example of that outside of what I said is, it didn't matter anyway. After someone, or after you experience rejection, something that you tried so hard for, you put your best foot forward, you didn't get it, and then you say, it didn't matter anyway. Women experience this a lot when it comes to dating. They can be walking down the street, minding their own business, and some dude decides to holler at them, and they're not attracted. And the dude responds with, well, you ain't that pretty anyway. That is a rationalizing ego. Perfect example of rationalizing ego. They are rationalizing your rejection instead of just saying, maybe they aren't interested in me, and being okay with that. Just because you show interest doesn't mean someone has to receive that interest. They may not be interested. They may be looking for something very different. So that's a perfect example of, again, that it didn't matter anyway. Oh, You ain't that fine. I'm laughing because I hear that story so many times. The next one is the intellectualizing ego. The intellectualizing ego focuses on abstract analysis to avoid emotional engagement. What does that mean? An intellectualizing ego thinks instead of feels. They haven't given themselves the permission to be able to go through the spectrum of emotions, so they get stuck. They get stuck in this space of overthinking. As a matter of fact, I seen this video on TikTok where this girl is talking about her grandmother or dad told her, I think it was her father, told her to get the overthinker because to date them, they've already thought about all the things that could go wrong and they still chose you, right? And I know her father told her that in with good intentions, but he was using a rationalizing ego because he wasn't even acknowledging that there are other perspectives. That sounded like something to help him process his overthinking to feel good about it himself, right? But the intellectualizing ego thinks instead of feels. We're learning a lot that overthinking can be a sign of you not functioning in a healthy way. And now we recognize that overthinking could be a sign that you are functioning in an intellectualizing ego because you don't want to feel the emotions. I don't want to feel sad. I don't want to feel confused. I don't want to feel like I don't even know how I feel. So I just think. Thinking is a safe space. I was in there for a long time, and it wasn't until really when we started this Reiki and healing thing, one of the things my friend said to me was, you've been functioning in your intellect for so long, it's time to work on your spirit again. And I promise you, there wasn't anything that I didn't think that I couldn't think my way out of. So I was functioning in an intellectualizing ego, right? It's thinking instead of feeling. It maintains control through cognition. An example of this is loss, right? Let's say you have a roommate, and one day the roommate tells you that they're going to move out. And instead of sitting in your feelings to be able to identify and feeling, sitting in your emotions, you begin to focus on bills. How much it's going to cost you, right? Instead of feeling lonely or sad, you just focus on what you need to do next. That happens a lot with grief and loss. Many of us don't want to sit in that space of grief. So we'll find something to think about, focus on, that doesn't allow us to sit with that grief, right? The next one is regression based ego. Regression based, not rationalizing, not intellectualizing, but regression based ego. It reverts to an earlier developmental behaviors under stress. So that's those times where we've done all this work to be a little more understanding. and we don't argue with everything. We recognize that I don't have to say everything. And then someone says something that hits that right button, and you revert back to the old you. I had that test in the conversation. I've grown so much, and this person knew me when I was in high school. It was funny because they spoke on the conundrum and why I don't want to be that person. When we talked about paying bills and things of that nature, I've had a couple of people talk to me about this paying bills, and they would say this thing: I want the old Anthony back, right? The old Peanut. Because the old Peanut said he would pay all the bills. But this friend was like, I want the old Peanut back. And right after they put the period on that sentence, they said, well, he was kind of mean. And all I could think about was, why would you want him back? Just because he'll pay a light bill? But he's going to be mean. That's what I mean about the performative male as well. At that point, I was being performative because who I was mean. But I knew as long as I pay some bills, people will eat that shit. And that's the truth. People will eat the bullshit I gave them just because I will keep a light on or pay a phone bill. But I didn't like being mean. And my identity goes beyond paying bills or how much I earn. But that was very funny that they were able to identify that, right? The regression-based ego restores a sense of safety. Usually, immediately after you function in that regression, you go back to your old self. You feel a little safer. Like, I cussed them out. And initially, you feel all right with that. So I have a sense of safety now. They won't do me like that anymore. But as you sit in those feelings, those emotions and feelings, and you process, new emotions come up. And you might not, and a lot of times, you might not always, and a lot of times, we don't feel good about the regression. And it makes us slide into another defense mechanism of the ego, right? Regression-based ego will show up during emotional overload. When we are emotionally overloaded, we spaz out. I used to tell people I was spastastic because I was spaz, and I was fantastic at it. If you hang around me enough, I have this thing with double words. So spastastic is one. I'll tell you, have a fanglorious time, a fantastic and a glorious time at the same time. I'm very good with this combining of words. So I was spastastic. The next ego defense mechanism is displacement ego. Displacement ego. It redirects emotions from a threatening source to a safer one. We really kind of, I really kind of experienced this when I was working with children with reactive attachment disorder, RAD, right? And what we would call this in that environment, displacement ego, what we would call that is target switching. Have you ever been in this situation where these two people are joking on each other and you laugh, and then one of them looks at you and says, "What you laughing at?" Have you ever been that person? If you've ever been that person, or you've seen that happen, target switching, that is displacement ego. It redirects the emotions from a threatening source to a safer one, right? The downside of displacement ego is it does not resolve the root conflict. As a matter of fact, it doesn't even work to resolve it. You've switched targets and moved on. They have switched targets and moved on. So now they're creating a new conflict before addressing the old conflict. Displacement ego isn't always just in that, but it's also in our daily lives. Not just in that example of you see people arguing and what you laughing at, but how often do we switch targets? We have people who come home from work and stressed, overworked, underpaid. And now the home must deal with those feelings because it's displaced ego has shown up. Have you ever worked for a supervisor that you can tell that they are having problems outside of the work because they come there and they terrorize everyone at the job? That is displacement ego. They are functioning in displacement ego, right? That is redirecting the anger from authority to family. Perfect example. The next, oh, I didn't bring no water. The next ego defense mechanism is reaction formation ego. And that expresses the opposite of an unacceptable impulse, right? So what that does is convert threats into overcompensated behavior. I remember one time a friend of mine and myself, we were having this conversation and we were actually talking about fighting. And one of the things that we couldn't understand is how somebody could get slapped and then don't fight. We just wind up thinking, well, you slapped. Whether you want to be in a fight or not, you're in one. They've put their hands on you, right? But this reaction formation ego is the space that they were functioning in. Instead of physically protecting themselves, they switched that to overcompensating, trying to talk the person out of it. Or I never forget, I seen this man get slapped in a circle, slapped so hard he spun in the circle and then ran home. Straight out the slap. I wish my homeboy was on here so we could talk about it. I don't know if you from where I'm from, but this is the old North Charlotte. Charlotte people know the new North Charlotte. It's changed. It's been gentrified. But the old North Charlotte used to be on the, as a matter of fact, I even tell you where we were. If you're from Charlotte, you know the plaza. And if you know the plaza, you know the food line on the plaza where the Crystals Reggae Club used to be. Well, behind that food line used to be all hood homes. It ain't all hood homes now. And I seen that man get slapped in the circle and ran home. That is a reaction formation. Instead of protecting himself, he made it an acceptable behavior by going home. Next is the sublimating ego. And the sublimating ego is the mature ego, right? So sublimating ego is an ego defense mechanism, but it also is a sign that you are functioning with maturity. So the sublimating ego transforms unacceptable impulses into acceptable behaviors. Instead of fighting it out, you decide to talk it out. As a matter of fact, I can tell it's wild because the questions made me assess this, but I can tell I've been moving into my sublimating ego as it relates to road rage. I talked about it last week. I used to be the king of road rage, right? But as I matured, I recognize that that rage means I've given control over myself to someone else. And I don't want someone else to have more control over me than I have over myself. So now I let it go. Because jumping out the car, walking up to the next person's car, all unacceptable behaviors. It is not okay to do those things at all. But what it is okay to do is let some things go, right? The sublimated ego integrates impulse rather than deny it. So, the example that I gave with road rage, I acknowledge that I'm frustrated. I feel the frustration. I may even say something crazy, but I let it go. That is a sign of integration and our power in transmutation. Being in a space where we can move on from emotions that we do not want to be stuck in. A space of frustration and anger is not a place that we want to be stuck in, right? The sublimated ego is adaptive and growth oriented. The sublimated ego is what helps you want to evolve into the best version of yourself. That is adaptive and growth oriented. You're here with us today because you are functioning in your sublimating ego, your mature ego, because you just want to be a little bit better today than you were yesterday. You want to know a little bit more today than you knew yesterday. The sublimating ego is the mature ego. And that's the ego we are trying to lead with as we function in our healthy ego. So now we've learned all this information about ego as a functional idea. Next, we'll move on ego as a spiritual idea. But now we've learned all this information on ego as a functional idea. So how do we assess how we are functioning in these different egos, right? Not the ego defense mechanisms, the four egos we discussed. Healthy ego, weak ego, inflated ego, and fragile ego. How do we know if we are functioning in either of these egos and where we are functioning, right? So here's some questions we can ask ourselves, starting with the inflated ego. Inflated ego. Do I assume I would rather that I would do things better than others in most situations? Have a moment and really think about that and ask yourself that question. Do you think that you would do things better than others in most situations? And if your initial thought is no, then I also will ask you to think about, have you ever said, I remember when I first got into my career field, or even going back once I learned this idea, I was easy to think back to high school where I didn't like group projects and things of that nature. It winds up tying into an inflated ego, right? So if you were one of those people that didn't like group projects and you use your rationalizing ego to tell you all the reasons, ways you don't like group projects. Your rationalizing ego was helping you function in an inflated ego. This idea of if you want it done right, you got to do it yourself. That is an inflated ego idea. You want it done right, someone else can do it right too. They may not do it like you, right? I also recognize that that space of you want it done right, you do it yourself, is also a space of lack of trust. So when you answer that question, have you ever aligned yourself with the idea of you want it done right? You got to do it yourself. Or the idea of I don't like group projects because they, and I, right? Next, you can ask yourself, do I explain, justify, or shift blame instead of simply owning my mistakes? The ironic thing is, when I ask that question, I can recognize that I don't live in the shape of justifying my mistakes. I really don't try to shift blame for my mistakes. But what I will do is explain, right? And with my rationalizing mind, I've always said, well, I don't want the person to understand it wrong. Or I don't want the person to feel hurt. So I'm in this space of over explaining myself instead of just saying, you're right. That was my mistake. I get caught up in worried about their feelings instead of just accepting my mistakes. Do you find yourself in a space where you explain or over explain yourself instead of just accepting your mistakes? Even if you have the best intentions of not wanting anyone else to be hurt, are you over explaining yourself? Are you justifying your mistakes? Will that happen only because do you shift blame? Well, if you didn't do that, I wouldn't have. If you do any of those things, those are a sign that you could be functioning in an inflated ego, a space of inflated ego. Next, do you assume that people who don't get it, people who don't agree with you, just don't get it? Does that naturally show up as your what you assume? That they just don't get it, right? As a matter of fact, one of those, let's just agree to disagree, could be a response for that example right there, for that question right there. I think they just don't get it. So now we're going to agree to disagree. No, we might just disagree. And I don't got to agree to disagree either. So, do you do you assume that people who don't agree with you just don't get it? Have you said multiple times to yourself, to your friends, to your loved ones, they just don't get it when explaining the response of someone else? Now, there's definitely a possibility that they don't get it, but this isn't about them. This is about you. This is about us together as a collective. So, do we assume that they just don't get it? Last question. for inflated ego, what would feel threatened if I wasn't as important, right, or capable as I believe? What would feel threatened to you if you weren't as important, right, or capable as you believe? You have a false sense of self. What will feel threatened if you found these things out? For myself, and because we're always transparent here, my sense of identity would feel threatened, specifically around that capable. Because low key, I really do think I'm capable of anything, right? Even though I can acknowledge that I'm not capable of anything. Like I can jump on a plane and fly it right now. I'm not capable of that, right? So it's easier to digest and swallow when it's the absurd, right? But what if you aren't even as capable in the things that you're good at? What if you aren't as capable as you think in your work? What would feel threatened? Like I said, for me, my sense of identity would somewhat be threatened, which is a sign that I too could be functioning in an inflated ego, right? And again, we know that the inflated ego shows up to protect the wounded ego. So now we'll ask questions on the wounded ego. How do we assess if we are functioning with a wounded ego? Wounded ego. First question you want to ask yourself is, what kind of criticism hurts you the most? And why? What kind of criticism hurts you the most? What kind of criticism hurts me the most? Criticism about my abilities. Criticism about my consideration. Criticisms about my identity. And why do those hurt me the most? Because I have so much investment, emotional investment in those things. And in many of them, it goes beyond the emotional investment. And some of them I've had to, so like my abilities, there's a physical investment in that. There's emotional, a spiritual investment in that. There's a mental investment in that. And when we invest a lot of ourselves into something, it becomes valuable. It almost is our baby. So, what kind of criticism hurts you the most, and why does that criticism hurt you the most? Next question. Do I replay situations in my mind over and over? That's a question for the overthinkers. Overthinkers can be functioning in a wounded ego because they don't know how to move on. They get stuck replaying the situation over and 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 over to the point that they'll rationalize being an overthinker and say that that's a good thing. You need to get you somebody that's an overthinker. But be very careful, because that overthinker could be functioning from a wounded ego. So do you replay situations over and over? For me, that is a space of growth. Answering some of these questions will also be able to give you the opportunity to look at where you've been, where you are, and where you need to go, right? There was a period where I'd get stuck replaying the situation. I never forget, speaking of that road rage, I never forget one day I was road raging. And I remember going to get my hair cut later that day, and I talked to my barber, who's my homeboy, and I said to him, I was thinking about that road rage over and over, all the way to the drive to the barbershop. I get in the chair, I tell my man, I was like, I should have got out the car. And he says, no, you shouldn't have. Somebody would have wrote down your tag. That lets me know that I was functioning in a wounded ego, right? So I also get to see that I've done some things to heal that, because I wouldn't do that today. It almost sounds absurd that I used to do those things, right? It almost sounds unbelievable that those were the behaviors I used to have. But I was functioning in a wounded ego that wasn't brought to the surface until I took the Reiki class, and they said to me, I remember, I will never forget the first day I really took some hape, and I started crying, and in them consoling me, they said, you can forgive your mom. And I was like, what are you talking about? Me and my mom are cool. Forgive her? What are you talking about? But I had repressed feelings. Repression ego as a defense mechanism so I can have a healthy sense of self that I didn't even know. And when they touched me, they could feel it. So do you replay situations over and over in your mind? Are you an overthinker? Are you functioning with a wounded ego because you don't know how to let go? I had somebody tell me on a first date, well, you'll never see me again. And I accepted that. And I respected that. And then 3 days later, they hit me. Trying to be manipulative, which I remember, but they wound up contacting me. Wounded ego. They said they thought about it all weekend. Wounded ego. Why are you thinking about it all weekend when you've already made your decision? Wounded ego. Do you make that decision and then still think about it and obsess over the decision? Wounded ego. Next, do I feel good enough in certain areas of my life? And that's one of those transparency moments, one of those honesty moments with self. Is there an area in your life that you don't feel good enough? My moment of transparency, and is wild and funny. I remember when my pops passed, right? Something that people just kept saying to me, and I thought that was so weird. I thought it was so weird. They just kept saying, you gonna be a good daddy. People would randomly say this, you're gonna be a good daddy. And I used to be like, why do you keep saying this to me? Right? Because there was a wound there. And the universe, God, my ancestors, all these people were coming together to pour into my spirit. And I didn't recognize that, right? Because I had unconscious worries about being a good father. Because I didn't have that direct example in my own life. Dating is a space where many of us don't feel good enough. Even though we can't really acknowledge it, or we can acknowledge it, but we don't. Many of us decide to opt out. We we mask it with things like there's pee in the dating pool, not recognizing that we are the pee in the dating pool. So do you feel good enough in certain areas of our lives? Do you feel good enough in certain areas of your life? I put the star specifically around dating because dating is an area where I'm shaping my worthiness, right? I had this I had this girl that I was trying to talk to for years. And she would always say, "You deserve someone better than me." And I never understood what they were talking about. Like, what the hell? I used to think about how crazy that sounded. But today I understand. And they were right. I do deserve somebody better than them. But the thing about it is, I didn't feel like I was good enough in dating that I could get better than them. And even though that one person played as an avatar, because when I look at my own life, they weren't the only person that I picked like that. My decisions were reflective on who I chose to date, who I chose to invest in, of my feelings that I did not feel good enough in that area of my life. Next, do you fear being ignored, dismissed, or overlooked? Wounded ego question. Do you fear being ignored, dismissed, or overlooked? And although the question says fear, we can replace that fear word with a couple of words. Do you feel frustrated? Do you feel anger? Do you feel saddened when being ignored, dismissed, or overlooked? When I looked at that for myself, I really didn't care about dismissed or overlooked because I don't know, I ain't like Front Street like that anyway. As crazy as it is, all the things that I've done that puts me in on Front Street, even including this. I'm not even a big person on Front Street. I didn't want to be on Front Street. The thing that bothered me the most that helped that when I answered this question was being ignored. Man, I promise you, by the time I got to high school, my number one pet peeve was being ignored. I hated that. You are liable to get in a fight with me for ignoring me. One of the reasons I hate it because I remembered as a child being ignored so much. I'll never forget the thing that helped me get over this ignored thing was becoming a teacher to 4-year olds, right? Because it allowed me to understand strategic ignoring. But I'd go to my parents and have this question or this idea or something I want to talk about. And because they have their own life, their own worries, their own concerns, their own loves, they didn't always have the emotional capacity to address mine. And they would ignore me. And I remember as a kid, I'm like, man, when I get big, I'm never going to ignore my children. I don't ever want them to feel like this. And then I got in a classroom with 20 children. And I learned the power of strategic ignoring. So then I no longer felt fear, frustration, sadness, confusion, any of those words when it came to being ignored. I gave people back their power because they have the right to ignore things that they don't want to. So, in the wounded ego, do you fear being ignored, dismissed, or overlooked? Next wounded ego question, last wounded ego question is, what about me feels most vulnerable to being seen, judged, or rejected? That is one of those real questions where we have to calm ourselves and really be authentic, because we think about this. As much as I say during the Reiki sessions that I do, everybody wants to be seen. The ironic thing about that is everybody also puts barriers up to keep themselves from being seen. So, because there's some aspect of themselves that they don't want to be seen. So, what about you feels most vulnerable to being seen, judged, or rejected? One, it's my efforts. It really produces emotions and feelings in me when my efforts are not seen, or when my efforts are rejected. Then ask yourself, after you identify what's most vulnerable, being seen, judged, or rejected, where does that belief come from? Where does that belief come from? Most of the time, where I've experienced rejection for my efforts has been in dating. Because I said envy was one of the things that I had to work on because I didn't have a jealous heart. We talked about the difference between jealousy and envy. Jealousy is thinking they don't deserve that, right? Envy is thinking, why ain't I got it too? And I used to be so envious when someone else's efforts wound up being recognized and in dating, the idea of my efforts being rejected, judged, or not even seen is where that my effort issue come from. The way I was raised, I am a overachiever because I was not congratulated for achieving. As a matter of fact, it was funny. I was talking to a friend, and this is the wild thing. This friend was in the nerd classes with me. Two things I said about the nerd classes: them honors classes. We are the other end of the spectrum, right? And I was telling them how when I graduated from high school, I had 15 scholarships. And the amount of people that walked up to me and said, I didn't know you were smart. What? did that mean? How did you not know? I'm hilarious. To be this funny, you gotta be quick thinking, right? Good timing. To be hilarious, I gotta be a little bit smart. Understand words. Understand how to put words together to make people laugh. So I used to be so shocked. I was so shocked. And I told that to my friend, and they said, dang, I ain't know that. What do you mean you didn't know that? You were in honors classes with me. What do you thought happens to honors kids? They just fall off the face of the earth? No, they continue to overwork themselves. So that came from that space of dating and how I was raised, not being valued for the accomplishments I did. When I graduated with those 15 scholarships, the people that I cared most about, the people that I loved the most, they were not amazed. They treated that like that was something I was supposed to do, when no one else was doing that. That's above. In my day, that was above the norm. People was lucky if they had 2. I had 15. Every school I applied to gave me money. Even schools I didn't apply to gave me money. I had 15, which was not normal. But being acknowledged for some of those things did not happen enough. And that's where that fear, that's where that vulnerability comes from as far as my efforts, right? And then once you ask yourself, where does that belief come from? You have to ask yourself, what do you fear it says about your worth? If you've been with the show for a while, when we created our words on my word board, family was first. Well, soul is first, okay? Family second. But one of the major things people had to pour into me, I had to reshape my relationship with, was worthy. Right? So, what did I fear that it said about my worthiness? That I was not worthy. Unless I did something astronomical that only 2 people in this world have ever done. Me and the other ninja that did it. I felt like I wasn't worthy. So when it came to them 15 scholarships, I didn't think I was worthy. The times I've been in the paper for doing something great, I didn't think I was worthy. When it came to dating, I didn't think I was worthy. And I didn't consciously acknowledge that, but my decisions reflected it deeply on where I went, on who I chose, and what I did. So after you identify what feels most vulnerable to being seen, judged, or rejected, ask yourself, where does that belief come from? And then ask yourself, what do you fear it says about your worth? What do you feel it says about your worth? All right, family. We've already hit almost 2 hours. Let's see. Let's do weak ego, and we'll wrap up with healthy ego next week. So here's some questions we can ask ourselves. A little star, a little store, a little store. Weak ego questions. How do we decide if we're working or functioning within a weak ego? one question we can ask ourselves is, do I avoid difficult situations because they feel like too much? I think about that when I talk about the people who opted out of their own lives, who chose not to date. Humans naturally want pair bonding. Humans naturally need that connection beyond just family, right? So whenever we opt out of that dating, even if we rationalize it, even if we project, even if we use any of those defense mechanisms, it is an example of us feeling like dating is too much. So, what do you find? I mean, do you avoid difficult situations because they feel like too much? Personally, I can do that with conversations. There are certain conversations that I don't want to have. As a matter of fact, perfect example of this, and it's one of the reasons why I'm thankful I have siblings, because when I don't have, they have to share, right? They can pour into me. So, of course, if you've been on the show, you know my mother isn't quite communicating with me now, right? And I was talking to my brother, and it's funny because her husband tries to do some stuff, and I just know it's gonna be too much. So my brother says, next time I come home, we gonna go over there together. And I say to him, one, I'm glad you my brother. Two, I'll do it for you. So I can lean on his strength to help me navigate a situation that I feel like is emotionally too much. The last time I did this by myself, I wind up running out the house in tears. This is as a grown man, right? So, are there situations that you avoid because you feel like they would be too much? Another question to ask yourself is, can I sit in discomfort or do I need to escape it? And for me, this is one of those questions that allow me to see where I've been and where I'm at, right? So, in this space of sobriety, in this space of healthy living, I recognize that some of those behaviors were escapism. When I got too stressed, I'd be like, I gotta go out and drink this weekend. I'm gonna call my friend, my college roommate, we're gonna get up and we're gonna have some drink this weekend. Didn't happen often, but it happened enough. But part of that was I didn't want to sit in the discomfort. And now I'm not doing any of those things. It gives me the opportunity to exercise my ability to sit in discomfort. And the good thing about that, it also gave me the opportunity to tap into my connections. So instead of escaping the reality, I can talk to a friend and they can help me process the reality when it becomes more than I can handle myself. So, can you sit in discomfort or do you need to escape it? Avoid it, drink it, smoke it, eat it? Do you need to escape the discomfort? Next question to ask yourself for a weak ego is, do I struggle to say no even when I want to? No. For me, that's not my thing. It has been. I used to overthink and waffle back and forth on no, 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 no. Should I say no? Is it fair? Blah, blah, blah. But what happens when I need that support one time? When somebody say no? I be worried about these hypothetical situations that I put in my mind. But a good question to ask yourself is, do you struggle to say no? How are your boundaries? We've been working on boundaries for the last couple of years, healthy boundaries specifically, and moving our boundaries away from our limits. So many of us should be able to say no. Last question is, when life becomes difficult, do I expand or contract? I recognize that there's still a space for me where I contract. When life becomes difficult, well, when money is tight, opportunities tight, things are stressful, when life becomes difficult, you know where you can find me? Disconnected. Not going out with my friends, not doing things. As a matter of fact, I'm thankful that I do have some of the friends that I do, because they'll recognize those moments and they'll help pull me out. They'll be like, you got to come out today. You got to do something right. So, when life comes difficult, do you expand or contract? Now, although I can still recognize spaces that I contract, I also can recognize an area of growth that I have grown, that I do expand. I have breathing exercises. I have meditation now. And I don't mind relying on friends to help me process. So I have some tools to navigate. So ask yourself, when life becomes difficult, do you expand or contract? All right. And with that, family, we'll wrap up this week's show. Next week we will, man, we done went over, right? We only supposed to be on for an hour. We've been on 2 hours. We've been going over the last couple of weeks though. We've been doing an hour and a half. We just been wilding out, just living our best lives, right? But it's a lot of information, a lot of different things to talk about. Next week we will finish up the functional ego with asking ourselves questions to assess our healthy ego. And then we'll start moving into the identity ego and learning what the identity ego is. And identity ego is simply a spiritual version of our ego. So we will do those things next week. So I hope to have you back here Tuesday at 7 p.m. Eastern. But before then, Thursday we'll have book club. So come on over to book club and let a brother read to you. We are reading Changeling right now by Victor Lavelle. Support that brother and buy his books. But enjoy that both 7 p.m. Eastern Time. All right. And before we go, I want to remind you that you can speak and hear the truth. Don't let one of those unhealthy defense mechanisms, ego defense mechanisms show up. You can communicate honestly with yourself and others. You live an authentic life, meaning you are consistent across environments, cultures, thoughts, and ideas. You are fearless and free. You no longer have to fear because you are getting the tools to be able to help you navigate. And you can trust what you have to say. You are the expert at your life. So you can trust what you have to say. And family, again, I thank you for that. Don't forget, if you're new, hit that like, that subscribe, that follow so you can get the notifications when we go live and help add to this collective energy of healing and the evolution of the best versions of ourselves. And with that, family, I want to say thank you for your time, your energy. I appreciate you, and you always put me in a space of gratitude. Peace, family.